In the spring of 1944, the map of the Eastern Front drew an anomaly that Soviet strategists had studied for months. While in the south, the Red Army had recovered vast extensions of Ukraine and had liberated Odessa, the central sector of the front remained almost intact since the end of 1943. The German Army Group Center remained clinging to a salient about 450 kilometers wide that penetrated deeply towards the east, covered in part by the dense Belarusian jungle and the Pripyat marshes. That line, stabilized throughout the winter, was the most powerful that the Wehrmacht had built in the east. Behind that front slept Belarus, a territory under German occupation since the summer of 1941. 3 years of systematic brutality had transformed the human landscape of the region. Hundreds of burned villages, massacred populations, Jews exterminated almost in their entirety. For the Germans, Belarus was a rear space, an area of exploitation and security. For the Red Army, it was the direct path towards Poland, towards the heart of the Reich, and more immediately, towards the southern flank of Army Group North that sustained the siege of Leningrad. Whoever controlled Belarus dominated the central axis of the European theatre. Army Group Center had available in June of 1944 4 armies: the 3rd Panzer Army, the 4th Army, the 9th Army and the 2nd Army, deployed over a front of approximately 1,100 kilometers. On paper, they counted on some 400,000 soldiers on the front line and another 400,000 in support and rear units. Their positions were not improvised. They had spent months building trenches, bunkers, minefields, wire obstacles, artillery positions and communication lines. The cities of Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev and Bobruisk had been declared by Hitler Feste Plätze, strongholds that had to resist even if they were cut off, even if the enemy surrounded them completely. The Führer was convinced that this strategy could freeze the Soviet advance as it had frozen previous offensives. What neither Hitler nor the German High Command understood in the summer of 1944 was that the Red Army was no longer the clumsy and poorly coordinated instrument of 1941, nor even that of 1942. It had learned from every defeat, and it was about to demonstrate it in a way that no army had seen until then. Maskirovka, the deception that left German intelligence blind. To understand why the collapse was so rapid and so total, it is necessary to understand the real state of the divisions of Army Group Center in June of 1944, beyond the organization charts that appear in the OKH reports. German infantry divisions on the Central Front were chronically below their nominal strength. An infantry division in 1944 had, in theory, between 12,000 and 15,000 men. In practice, most of the divisions of Army Group Center counted on between 6,000 and 9,000 real personnel. Each division covered a front of 12 to 25 kilometers, in some cases up to 30 kilometers in swampy sectors where the scarcity of roads made the movement of enemy forces difficult. Reserves were scarce. A regiment generally maintained a reinforced company in reserve, a division and a battalion. The Army Corps had available between 2 infantry battalions and 1 regiment, reinforced sometimes with a tank battalion and 1 of assault guns. The 3rd Panzer Army, despite its name, was panzer only in designation. It consisted of 7 infantry divisions, 2 Luftwaffe field divisions and 1 security division. It had no organic panzer formations worthy of that name. The 4th Army counted on 8 infantry divisions, 2 Panzer Grenadier and 1 of security. The 9th Army, the southernmost, was the one that had some real armoured presence, but was also seriously overextended. The Luftwaffe field divisions, created by Göring to maintain control of his own men under an aerial banner instead of transferring them to the army, were generally of inferior quality to regular infantry divisions. Their officers, trained in the context of aviation and not ground combat, had less experience in the type of elastic defense in depth that the best units of the army mastered. In Bagration, the sector defended by the 4th and 6th Luftwaffe field divisions was one of those that collapsed most rapidly. Regarding material, the situation was equally precarious. The ratio of forces in armor was particularly unfavorable for the Germans. Army Group Center had available some 570 tanks and self-propelled guns in total for the entire front. The Red Army deployed more than 5,200 in the 4 fronts of Bagration, with enormous concentrations in the planned breakthrough sectors. In the sector of the 1st Baltic Front, where the 6th Guards Army would attack, the Soviets had 204 tanks deployed along the 6 kilometers of the main attack zone, compared to barely a few handfuls of German armor in the entire sector. German logistics were another point of grave vulnerability. The railroads that supplied Army Group Center suffered continuous attacks from partisans for months. Fuel depots were insufficiently supplied. Many German vehicles on the front line functioned only when fuel was available, which limited their mobility just when it was most needed. German industry produced war material in record quantities in 1944, thanks to Minister Speer, but the distribution system towards the Eastern Front was under increasing pressure, with railroads bombed by Allied aviation from the west and sabotaged by partisans from the east. The codename of the operation was not chosen randomly. Prince Pyotr Ivanovich Bagration, a general of Georgian origin born in 1765, was one of the most aggressive commanders of the Napoleonic Wars. He commanded the right wing of the Russian army at Austerlitz in 1805, and in 1812 he commanded half of the Russian army against the French invasion. He wanted to fight in decisive battles. He was a supporter of frontal shock when the situation required it. At Borodino in September of 1812, he received a mortal wound in the leg that killed him weeks later. He was a symbol of victorious sacrifice, of defense that becomes the defeat of the invader. When the Stavka, the Soviet Supreme High Command, chose that name for its summer offensive of 1944, the choice had a deliberate historical weight. The offensive was to begin on June 22nd, the exact third anniversary of Operation Barbarossa. The day on which Hitler had launched his crusade of exterminio against the Soviet Union in 1941. The date was a message for the Soviet people themselves, but also for the enemy. The strategic conception of Bagration was born in the weeks prior to the winter of 1944. General Alexei Antonov, deputy chief of the Soviet General Staff, presented the initial plan to the Stavka in the spring. The central idea was to attack not where the enemy expected it, but exactly where they believed they were most secure. All German intelligence pointed to the main Soviet effort that summer falling upon Army Group North Ukraine in the southern sector, continuing the pressure initiated with the liberation of Ukraine. It was a reasonable prediction. It was where the terrain was most favorable for armor and where the Soviets had accumulated their best forces during 1943. Army Group Center felt by comparison relatively secure. Soviet planners decided to exploit exactly that complacency. The final plan approved by Stalin contemplated an offensive on 4 simultaneous fronts. The First Baltic Front, under the command of General Ivan Bagramyan, would attack from the north towards Vitebsk. The Third Belarusian Front, under General Ivan Chernyakhovsky, would press towards Orsha and Vitebsk from the northeast. The Second Belarusian Front, under Georgy Zakharov, would advance on Mogilev from the east, and the First Belarusian Front, commanded by Konstantin Rokossovsky, would attack from the south over Bobruisk and point towards Minsk. The convergent objective of the 4 fronts was to close a gigantic pocket around Army Group Center, pocket hundreds of thousands of men and destroy them. The 2 coordinators designated by the Stavka to supervise the entire operation were Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, who would take charge of the northern sector, and Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who would supervise the southern sector. Zhukov was already the most decorated military man of the Soviet Union, the man who had defended Moscow in 1941, directed the counterattack of Stalingrad, and launched the breakthrough of the siege of Leningrad. Vasilevsky was the operational architect behind much of the Soviet planning since 1942. With these 2 men at the helm, the Stavka was not improvising. Before the first Soviet shell crossed the German lines, Bagration had already won an invisible battle. It was the battle of disinformation. The Soviet deception operation, known in its doctrine as maskirovka, which means masking or operational camouflage, reached in Bagration its most refined expression of the entire war. The objective was to convince the German High Command that the summer of 1944 would be like previous ones. The main Soviet effort would strike in the south, probably in the Ukraine sector, possibly towards the Balkans or towards Romania, to cut the oil supply of the Reich. Army Group North Ukraine, under the command of General Walter Model, would receive the main blow. Army Group Center could hold. To sustain this deception, the Soviets adopted extraordinary measures. Troop movements towards the Belarus front were carried out exclusively at night, with strict prohibitions on lighting fires or using radios. The uniforms of the soldiers could not be distinguished from those of the defensive units already present. Vehicles were camouflaged with branches and tarps. Pontoon bridges were laid under the water so that German reconnaissance aviation could not detect them. Trains bringing reinforcements arrived in the dark and unloaded far from the front. Parallelly, false information channels were fed so that German spies and the intelligence of the Fremde Heere Ost, the intelligence service of the Army of the East, directed by Colonel Reinhard Gehlen, would record fictitious movements in the southern sector. Ghost tank divisions appeared in simulated radio positions in Ukraine. The noise of recorded tank engines was played through speakers. Exploration parties increased their activity in secondary sectors so that the Germans would perceive unusual activity precisely where there was going to be no decisive attack. The results of this deception were documented after the war. On June 14th of 1944, barely 8 days before the start of Bagration, the Fremde Heere Ost published an evaluation that correctly identified a certain concentration of forces in the Belarus sector, but attributed it to defensive operations or secondary pressure. The main effort of the summer, the German analyst concluded, would continue to be in the south. Field Marshal Ernst Busch, commander of Army Group Center, and his subordinates received reassuring reports. Their most valuable armored reserves, the 4th Panzer Division and the 5th Panzer Division, had been sent precisely to the southern sector, to Army Group North Ukraine, in anticipation of the attack that would never arrive there. The failure of German intelligence in Bagration is one of the most studied in the history of military information services. Colonel Gehlen himself, who after the war directed the intelligence service of Federal Germany, wrote in his memoirs that Soviet deception operations had been extraordinarily effective. But his memoirs, written decades later during the Cold War, also tended to attribute to Hitlerian political interference part of the analysis errors that corresponded to his own organization. Declassified archives do not fully support that exculpatory interpretation. When June of 1944 arrived, Army Group Center had in its frontline sector barely some 570 tanks and self-propelled guns. The Red Army was about to deploy against it more than 5,200. It was a proportion that no deception could have matched, but Maskirovka ensured that the Germans did not know with sufficient advance what was coming down on them as to at least reorganize their reserves. The Red Army that prepared for Bagration in June of 1944 was a military organism radically different from the one that had suffered the catastrophes of 1941. 4 years of brutal war, of defeat and resurgence, of relentless analysis of one's own errors, had forged a force that combined overwhelming mass with growing tactical and operational competence. The figures of the concentration were of historical scale. The 4 fronts destined for Bagration totaled approximately 1,700,000 soldiers, 5,200 tanks and self-propelled guns, 36,000 pieces of artillery and mortars, including some 2,000 Katyusha multiple rocket launchers, and more than 5,000 aircraft. Against these forces, Army Group Center had available perhaps a third of the men and a small fraction of the armored material. Throughout the planned breakthrough sectors, Soviet superiority was crushing. In some areas, 10 Soviet soldiers for every German, 10 to 15 Soviet artillery pieces against 1 German. But numbers alone do not explain Bagration. The key was in how the use of that superiority was organized. The lessons accumulated since Stalingrad had given shape to a much more sophisticated Soviet operational doctrine. The recurring failures of the past, the poor coordination between infantry and armor, the artillery that did not correctly suppress enemy defenses before the assault, the tanks that advanced alone without infantry and were relatively easily destroyed, had been analyzed in detail and specific remedies had been designed. For Bagration, each army performed extensive individual preparation. General Kuzma Galitsky, commander of the 11th Guards Army, part of the 3rd Belarusian Front, described the process in detail in his memoirs. In a few weeks, his army received 20,000 reinforcement soldiers, more than 9,000 machine guns, 42 direct support regimental guns, 167 anti-tank guns of the 1943 model, and 120 Su-76 self-propelled guns. Each division was equipped with its own detachment of self-propelled tanks. Units practiced the assault in training zones that faithfully reproduced the German defensive positions. Battalion commanders, who historically had the highest casualty rates due to the nature of close combat, received 10-day courses. The simulations included real artillery fire and encounters with tanks to eliminate the initial fear of fire. Artillery deserved special attention. The Red Army had learned that the initial artillery preparation was not enough to destroy German defences if it was concentrated in the first meters of trenches. Defences in depth required fire in depth. The Bagration plans contemplated an initial artillery preparation of between 1 and 3 hours, followed by continuous support during the advance of the infantry, with the capacity to redirect fire towards resistant positions that had not been neutralized. Artillery regiments would receive instructions to stay in direct contact with the assault infantry, advancing with it. The role of aviation was also integrated in a new way. The 1st Air Army, the 3rd Air Army, the 4th Air Army and the 16th Air Army, with more than 5,000 aircraft in total, had received instructions to prioritize the suppression of German artillery, fuel and ammunition depots, and rear railroad nodes. Fighters would cover the airspace to deny visual information and the intervention of the Luftwaffe. In 1944, Soviet aviation already had air supremacy over the Central Front, something unthinkable in 1941. Soviet air superiority had practical consequences that went beyond bombings. It meant that German aerial reconnaissances, which could have detected the accumulation of Soviet forces before the attack, were systematically intercepted or deterred. The Luftwaffe on the Central Front had available in June of 1944 fewer than 800 aircraft of all types, compared to more than 5,000 Soviet. Their pilots were in many cases experienced, but were outnumbered in a proportion that made continuous coverage of the front impossible. The days prior to the start of Bagration, the few reconnaissance missions that the Germans managed to complete only captured fragments of the puzzle and failed to transmit to the command a coherent image of what was being prepared. Another factor habitually underestimated was the improvement in the communications of the Red Army, largely facilitated by the supply of trucks and radio equipment from the Western Allies through the Lend-Lease program. The more than 400,000 trucks received from the United States and Great Britain gave Soviet formations a capacity for movement that the Red Army of 1941 and 1942 simply did not have. They allowed ammunition and fuel reserves to advance more rapidly behind the armored tips, delaying the moment in which the advance was logistically exhausted. Without those trucks, Bagration would have reached perhaps Minsk, but hardly Vilnius and Brest in the same impulse. There was a dimension of Bagration that did not appear in any conventional order of battle, but which proved decisive. Under German occupation, in the forests and marshes of Belarus, tens of thousands of partisan fighters had been operating for years against the enemy rear. And on the night of June 19th to 20th, 1944, 3 days before the official start of Bagration, all of them received the signal. In a single night, the Belarusian partisans executed approximately 10,500 simultaneous railroad demolitions. The railroad lines that supplied Army Group Center remained blocked at hundreds of points. Telegraph communications between German headquarters were cut. Fuel depots at specific points were sabotaged or attacked. The German rear, which already suffered chronic supply problems, was practically paralyzed at the most critical moment. The partisan movement in Belarus was, in the summer of 1944, a force organized and coordinated from Moscow. Although its subsequent image in Soviet historiography was idealized and some units also showed criminal behaviors against the civilian population, its operational effectiveness was indisputable. The commander of Army Group Center himself recognized in his reports that it was impossible to guarantee control of the territory in the rear. Anti-partisan cleaning operations could temporarily suppress activity, but in weeks it would arise again. By June of 1944, the partisans had moved thousands of their fighters further west, expanding the radius of their operations precisely at the moment in which the main offensive was being launched. The partisan movement in Belarus was, in the summer of 1944, a force organized and coordinated from Moscow. Although its subsequent image in Soviet historiography was idealized, and some units also showed criminal behaviors against the civilian population, its operational effectiveness was indisputable. The testimony of the partisan brigade reports sent to the center throughout 1943 and early 1944 showed a constant escalation of pressure on German communications. Attacks against railroad tracks grew in frequency and sophistication. Trains derailed regularly. Gasoline depots in the villages that remained in the rear were set on fire. Telephone cables that connected division headquarters with those of Corps and Army were systematically cut, forcing the use of radio communications that could be intercepted. The commander of Army Group Center himself recognized in his reports that it was impossible to guarantee control of the territory in the rear. Anti-partisan cleaning operations could temporarily suppress activity, but in weeks it would arise again. By June of 1944, the partisans had moved thousands of their fighters further west, expanding the radius of their operations precisely at the moment in which the main offensive was being launched. The assassination of General Commissar Wilhelm Kuber of Belarus in September of 1943, coordinated by the partisans who introduced a bomb under his mattress by means of an agent infiltrated in his domestic service, had been the most spectacular action of the movement before Bagration. Kube had alternated in his management of the occupation acts of extreme brutality against the Jewish population, with certain attempts to build local support among the non-Jewish Belarusian population, which had earned him the simultaneous enmity of the partisans and the more radical factions of the SS. His death did not change the German occupation policy, but it proved that no Reich official was safe in Belarusian territory. The magnitude of the damage caused by the partisans on the night of June 19th was such that several ammunition and fuel trains destined for the frontline German units could not reach their destinations before the bombardment began. When on June 22nd the Soviet guns started to fire, many German soldiers waited in their positions without the ammunition reserves that they had been promised. 57,000 prisoners parade through Moscow, the stroll of German defeat. In the early morning of June 22, 1944, the Eastern Front dawned in silence along hundreds of kilometers. It was the third anniversary of Barbarossa. Many German soldiers in their trenches noted the date. Some mentioned it in letters to their families that same night, letters that many would not manage to send. Reconnaissance in force operations began that same day in the northern sector. The Soviet battalions that were in the vanguard tested the German defences of the 3rd Panzer Army and the 4th Army to identify weak points and adjust artillery plans. The Germans responded with intense fire, convinced that they were repelling probing attacks. They did not understand the magnitude of what was approaching. The main offensive formally began on June 23rd. At 5:00 in the morning, 22,000 guns and mortars opened fire simultaneously along the 4 attack sectors. Witnesses described the sound as continuous thunder that made it impossible to distinguish individual detonations, a wall of noise that vibrated in the ground for kilometers around. The Katyushas added their particular din, their volleys of rockets that fell in clusters over the enemy positions, creating a zone of total destruction. Soviet aircraft attacked German artillery and communications nodes in depth. After 2 or 3 hours of artillery preparation, the Soviet infantry advanced. In the northern sector, Bagramyan's 1st Baltic Front broke the front to the north and south of Vitebsk. In the north-central sector, Chernyakhovsky's 3rd Belarusian Front attacked simultaneously from 2 axes, one towards Vitebsk and another towards the Orsha corridor, along the Moscow-Minsk highway. In the central sector, Zakharov's 2nd Belarusian Front pressed on Mogilev. And in the south, Rokossovsky's 1st Belarusian Front launched its famous breakthrough in 2 axes towards Bobroysk. The first hours revealed the magnitude of the difference in preparation. In several sectors, the German defences crumbled with a speed that surprised the attackers themselves. The frontline German divisions, with a defensive front of 12 to 25 kilometers per division, were simply too overextended to absorb the blow. In some points, Soviet superiority in the attack sector reached 10 to 1 in men and 15 to 1 in guns. The soldiers who had survived the initial bombardment, many of them dazed, partially buried, deprived of communication with their commanders, faced waves of Soviet infantry that, following the new doctrine, did not stop to clear the trenches, but advanced forward, leaving the resistant positions for the following waves. General Hans Traut, commander of the 78th Assault Division in the Orsha sector, commanded one of the most prepared units of Army Group Center. He had artillery support available, including 31 Stug 3 assault guns and 18 Nashorn anti-tank. Despite this, he reported that his troops were outnumbered in a ratio of 10 to 1. The 25th Panzer Grenadier Division, which shared the sector with him, was simply overrun. Orsha, the railroad node that Hitler had designated a stronghold, fell on June 26th into the hands of the Soviet 11th Guards Army. In the north, the situation was equally catastrophic for the Germans. The Leifried Army Corps, which defended Vitebsk under the command of General Friedrich Gollwitzer, remained enclosed when the Soviet fronts converged from the north and the south of the city. Hitler reaffirmed his order to hold Vitebsk at all costs. Gollwitzer had no other option than to obey. The 3rd Panzer Army tried to open a rescue corridor, but did not manage to close the breach. Vitebsk remained completely surrounded on June 25th. 4 days later it capitulated. Some 30,000 German troops were captured or died in the cauldron. In the south, Rokossovsky executed a tactical maneuver that his own superiors, including Marshal Zhukov, had questioned during planning, an attack on 2 divergent axes to the north and south of Bobroysk, instead of the single axis that conventional doctrine recommended. When Rokossovsky explained his reasoning in a Stavka session presided over by Stalin, the dictator interrupted the doubts of the other marshals. Rokossovsky has thought it through well. Trust him. The double attack turned out to be exactly correct. While the German 35th Infantry Division and 36th Infantry Division, which defended the southern front of Bobroysk, were crushed, Soviet armor surrounded the city from both sides. On June 27th, the Soviet Third Army broke through the northern sector of the Yakhi-Seytaks 5th Army Corps, and the 65th Army crossed the south. Bobroysk remained enclosed with some 70,000 German soldiers inside. On June 28th, when barely 5 days of the main offensive had passed, Marshal Busch was dismissed. Hitler replaced him with Marshal Walter Model, known in the Wehrmacht as Hitler's fireman, for his talent in stabilizing broken fronts. Model had executed a series of successful tactical retreats on the northern front during previous years. Now he received the task of stopping what was already a chain collapse. When Model arrived at the Army Group Center headquarters in Lida on June 28th, he found a situation that by far exceeded any previous crisis that he had managed. The front did not have holes, it had no front. The Soviet armored and infantry masses flowed towards the west without finding a continuous line of resistance. The German units that had not been already captured or destroyed retreated in chaotic columns along the roads towards the west, mixed with refugees, with abandoned vehicles, with wounded that no one could evacuate. Model immediately issued his characteristic orders: no step back without his explicit authorization, fight to the last man in the current positions, constitute new defensive lines wherever they were. It was the same philosophy that he had applied in the north. But now he faced a different scale. The broken front measured 300 kilometers wide and was defended, in the best case, by 8 real combat formations against 116 Soviet rifle divisions, 6 cavalry divisions, 16 motorized infantry brigades, and 42 armored brigades. In that framework of total disintegration, Model's response was to install roadblocks on all main roads and paths, shoot deserters on the spot, and reorganize the remnants of the units into combat groups that could maintain even if only isolated points of resistance. It was the only option available. The Kampfgruppen were ad hoc formations composed of the survivors of several different divisions, sometimes without internal cohesion, without the joint training that organic unity gives, but with the weaponry still available. On the roads towards the west, the Kampfgruppen sometimes managed to delay Soviet columns for hours or even days, but it was a postponement, not a real defense. The speed of the Soviet advance meant that in many sectors the Germans could not reconstitute a continuous line before the next wave of Soviet armored and motorized troops bypassed them again. The tanks of the 5th Guards Tank Army and the 2nd Guards Tank Corps advanced 30, 40, even 50 kilometers per day on the days of greatest penetration, jumping from road to road, looking for points where there was no organized resistance, which were the majority. The immediate objective of the Red Army was Minsk, the capital of Belarus and the most important logistic node of Army Group Center. Through Minsk passed all the main railroads and roads that connected the front with Poland and Germany. Whoever controlled Minsk closed the trap. The Soviet 2nd Guards Tank Corps reached the limits of Minsk on July 2nd. The combats in the streets of the city were intense. The Germans had declared Minsk a stronghold under Hitler's order and defended it with a mixture of rear units, garrison personnel, recovered wounded and remnants of shattered divisions. On the outskirts, the 12th Panzer Division, with some 12,000 men, 35 Panzer IV tanks, 9 Panzer III tanks, 91 armoured personnel carriers and 12 Vespa self-propelled, formed the Bergen blocking formation in an attempt to open an escape route. Its success was limited. On July 3rd, the 65th Army and the 5th Guards Tank Army closed the path west of Minsk, trapping the bulk of the German 4th Army and the remnants of the 9th Army. Marshal Zhukov, observing the battle, described the situation with a clinical coldness. The Germans were drawn into prolonged frontal defensive battles instead of retreating rapidly towards a rear line and moving strong forces towards their threatened flanks. That doomed them. The city of Minsk fell on July 3rd. Inside the pocket east of the city, some 100,000 German soldiers remained trapped. The Soviets subjected them to continuous attacks, and the resistance lasted for several more days. Only a fraction managed to escape, mostly on foot, abandoning heavy weaponry. The bulk was annihilated or captured. In 10 days of offensive, Army Group Center had lost the totality of 4 armies as an organized combat force. The contrast with the disaster of Stalingrad, with which so many later compared Bagration, was significant. In Stalingrad, 300,000 men of the German 6th Army took 2 months to be completely destroyed. In Belarus, in barely 10 days, the Red Army had destroyed or trapped more men. German losses in the first 2 weeks of Bagration already exceeded those of Stalingrad. On July 17th of 1944, an unusual scene took place in the streets of Moscow. The Stavka had organized a parade of German prisoners of war so that the Soviet population could see with their own eyes the extent of the victory. 57,000 German prisoners marched through the streets of the Soviet capital, headed by several captured generals. The cortege took 3 hours to parade, soldiers, officers, generals. At the front, the generals in their uniforms with all their decorations. Behind, the columns of men on foot, dusty, many wounded, all with faces marked by days or weeks of desperate combat and surrender. The crowd of Muscovites that crowded the sidewalks generally kept a cold silence, although at some points there were incidents of tension. The Soviet authorities distributed street sweepers behind the parade to clean the streets, a gesture of calculated humiliation. It was not only propaganda, it was the tangible demonstration that Bagration had destroyed the heart of German military power in the east. Army Group Center, which in June counted on more than 800,000 men including support units, had ceased to exist as an operational force. Estimates of German casualties in the first 6 weeks of the operation range between 300,000 and 350,000 men among dead, wounded and captured, plus the almost total loss of heavy material of 4 armies. The destruction of Army Group Center did not stop the Soviet momentum. The Stavka had already planned the exploitation of the breakthrough much further beyond Minsk, and the Soviet armies, although fatigued and with supply lines extended to the maximum, continued advancing. In the north, Bagramyan's First Baltic Front pushed towards Polotsk, which fell on July 4th, threatening the link between Army Group North and the now non-existent Army Group Center. Model desperately begged the Oberkommando des Heere to transfer divisions from Army Group North towards the south to plug the holes, but the requests were slow to be approved, and when the divisions arrived it was too late for the sector they were to cover. In the central sector, Chernyakhovsky's Third Belarusian Front headed towards Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania. Hitler had declared it, of course, another stronghold. The garrison commander, Luftwaffe General Rainer Stahel, had a mixture of battalions from different units available, some Fallschirmjäger, 88mm anti-aircraft artillery employed in anti-tank role and garrison personnel. The Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army surrounded the city before the 4 panzer divisions that Hitler wanted to gather for its defense could arrive, with the result that the garrison had to defend alone. The combats in Vilnius lasted from July 7th to 13th. German Fallschirmjäger used destroyed T-34 tanks as defensive positions, fighting a street-by-street combat that delayed the Soviet advance several days. The Luftwaffe announced the destruction of 30 Soviet tanks in a single night outside the city, but it did not change the final result. On July 13th, after more than 5 days of continuous combat, the surviving garrison capitulated. Some 13,000 German soldiers had died or were wounded in the defense of Vilnius. On the night of July 12th to 13th before the capitulation, some 3,000 soldiers managed to escape in a night breakthrough operation, previously destroying their heavy weaponry and swimming across the river to reach the advances of the German 6th Panzer Division. It was a minimal relief in the context of the general disaster, but it proved that the will to resist of individual German soldiers had not disappeared. Bagration plus Lvov-Sandomierz, the summer that split the Reich in two. While Army Group Center disintegrated in Belarus, the Stavka coordinated a second massive offensive in the southern sector that expanded the dimensions of the German catastrophe to continental proportions. On July 13th, barely 3 weeks after the start of Bagration, the First Ukrainian Front under Marshal Ivan Konev launched Operation Lvov-Sandomierz against Army Group North Ukraine, precisely the forces that the Germans had reinforced in anticipation of a main attack that never arrived. The irony was complete. The panzer divisions and the reserves sent south to resist the main Soviet blow found themselves in the right place for the wrong attack, while in the north, the divisions withdrawn to reinforce the south left gaps that the Red Army crossed like a torrent. On July 18th, the Soviets surrounded the German 13th Army Corps around Brody with some 45,000 men inside. A gap of 170 kilometers had opened in the front of Army Group North Ukraine. The SS Viking divisions and other elite formations launched desperate counterattacks, some of them with their Panthers and Stug 3 fighting with a tactical competence that the Soviets themselves recognized, but without being able to seal the breakthrough. Around 3,500 soldiers of the 1st SS Galician Grenadier Division managed to escape the encirclement, but without armor, exhausted, without immediate operational value. Lvov fell on July 26th. The Wehrmacht had been expelled from western Ukraine. The 4th Panzer Army was retreating at full speed towards the Vistula. The 1st Panzer Army and the 1st Hungarian Army fell back towards the Carpathians. The seismic effect of these losses propagated towards the north, towards the south, and towards the flank of the already destroyed Army Group Center. On July 20th of 1944, while Bagration continued rolling west, something occurred in the Führer's headquarters in East Prussia that changed the perception of the conflict in Germany, although not its immediate military result. Colonel Klaus Schenk von Stauffenberg detonated a bomb in the meeting room of the Wolf's Lair. Hitler survived. The failed attack triggered Operation Valkyrie in Berlin, an attempted coup d'etat by army officers that ended in failure a few hours later. Stauffenberg and his main accomplices were executed that same night in the courtyard of the War Ministry. In the following days and weeks, the Gestapo unraveled a network of conspirators that included frontline figures of the army: General Ludwig Beck, Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, General Friedrich Fromm, Colonel Rudolf Christoph von Gersdorf, Lieutenant Colonel Henning von Treschow, who committed suicide on the Eastern Front the day before the attack to avoid being captured, and dozens more officers. The coincidence between the collapse of Bagration and the coup attempt was not accidental. Many of the conspirators had spent months or even years convinced that the war was lost, and that the only way out was to eliminate Hitler and negotiate with the Western Allies before the Red Army reached Berlin. The Belarus catastrophe, visible to all staff officers since the end of June, gave the attack an urgency that the conspiracy had postponed too many times. The failure of July 20th not only liquidated the conspirators, but temporarily strengthened Hitler's position against the surviving generals, convinced that Providence had protected him for a higher destiny. Marshal Model, who managed the disaster in Belarus while the attack occurred, was one of the few field marshals who had no contact with the conspiracy and who responded on July 20th with explicit loyalty to the regime. His position with Hitler, already privileged, was further consolidated. In mid-August of 1944, the momentum of Bagration began to exhaust itself. Not because of German resistance, which had been partially reconstituted with divisions brought from other fronts, but because of its own logistical limits. Soviet supply lines had extended hundreds of kilometers beyond their starting bases. The railroads, which used a Soviet gauge different from the European one, required time to be readapted as the fronts advanced. Tanks needed maintenance. The infantry had been fighting for weeks without rest. The Red Army needed to stop, even if only temporarily. On August 15th, the Stavka ordered the suspension of offensive operations in the main sectors. The front stabilized approximately along the Vistula and the East Prussian border. At that moment, Rokossovsky's first Belarusian front had reached the outskirts of Warsaw, and its advanced armoured units were in Praga, the eastern suburb of the Polish capital, east of the Vistula. It was then when one of the most debated and darkest tragedies of the Second World War occurred. On August 1st of 1944, the Polish Home Army, under the command of General Tadeusz Komorowski, launched the Warsaw Uprising against the German garrison. The Poles acted under the assumption that the Red Army was about to cross the Vistula and that liberating Warsaw before the Soviets arrived would establish the necessary political precedent to claim Polish sovereignty over the capital against Stalin's pressures. The Red Army did not cross the Vistula. The Soviet armoured units that had reached Praga stopped their advance. The Germans, under the command of SS Obergruppenführer Erich von dem Vasilevsky, and with special reinforcements including Oskar Dirlwanger's criminal prisoner brigades and Mieczysław Kamiński's Cossacks, crushed the uprising during 63 days of urban combat. The city was systematically razed. Some 200,000 people died, the vast majority Polish civilians. The question of whether Stalin could have launched the Red Army across the Vistula in time to support the uprising, or if he deliberately held back the advance to let the Germans eliminate the leaders of the non-communist Polish resistance movement, is one of the historical debates that remains without definitive resolution. Soviet military sources argue that logistical exhaustion made a new large-scale advance impossible in August. Some Western historians and the Polish perspective have pointed out that the Stavka had the capacity to at least provide aerial support, or allow the use of Soviet airfields to the Western Allied aviation that attempted to supply the insurgents, and that the refusal to do so had a deliberate political dimension. Stalin considered the Armia Krajowa a reactionary and anti-communist force whose elimination suited his plans for control of post-war Poland. Whatever the complete truth may be, the fate of Warsaw became a permanent shadow over the military victory of Bagration. When Operation Bagration officially concluded on August 19th of 1944, the map of the Eastern Front had changed in an unrecognizable way. The Red Army had advanced between 500 and 600 kilometers in 6 weeks. Belarus was liberated, Lithuania largely. Army Group Center had been destroyed as an organized combat force. Casualty figures are a subject of discussion among historians, but the most grounded estimates point to between 300,000 and 400,000 German casualties among dead, wounded and prisoners during the main phase of the operation, with 23 generals captured and 9 dead. The Wehrmacht lost most of the heavy equipment of 4 armies. Thousands of artillery pieces, hundreds of tanks, tens of thousands of transport vehicles. The German General Staff had nothing with which to replace those losses. The Red Army also suffered significant casualties. Estimates vary between 180,000 and 200,000 irrecoverable casualties among dead and missing, with several 100,000 wounded. Soviet armor losses were significant in absolute terms, but the production rate of the Soviet war industry, which throughout 1944 delivered more than 20,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, allowed those losses to be absorbed without global offensive capacity suffering. On the broader strategic level, the consequences of Bagration redefined the European theatre. Army Group North in the Baltic countries remained in a precarious position upon seeing its land link with the rest of the German front cut. In October of 1944, the Red Army launched the first East Prussian offensive, which briefly penetrated German territory before being stopped. The Wehrmacht destined its last reserves of Tiger II tanks and available panzer divisions to stop that advance, but it was only a postponement. The threat of the Red Army reaching the Balkans, accelerated by the collapse of Army Group North Ukraine in parallel with Bagration, precipitated the defection of Romania on August 23rd of 1944 and of Bulgaria on September 9th. By October, Soviet units were on the Hungarian border. By January of 1945, the Vistula-Oder offensive launched from the Polish bridgeheads would take the Red Army to the Oder, 60 kilometers from Berlin. Bagration was not only a victory of numerical superiority, it was, furthermore, a demonstration of Soviet operational competence that transformed the war. The success of the operation rested on 4 pillars that military historians have repeatedly analyzed. The first was strategic deception. The Maskirovka of Bagration was the most ambitious and successful of the war. It managed to keep the German High Command convinced for weeks, even when the offensive was already underway, that it was seeing a secondary effort and that the main blow would arrive in the south. This had direct consequences. The best panzer reserves were where they should not be when the front broke. The second pillar was the synchronization of forces. 4 separate fronts attacked almost simultaneously, which deprived the German command of the possibility of transferring reserves from one threatened sector to another. In every previous crisis that the Wehrmacht had managed on the Eastern Front, the rapid movement of mobile reserve divisions from one sector to another had allowed the holes to be plugged. In Bagration, there was no free sector from which to withdraw the forces. The third was the integration of combined arms. The Red Army of 1944 combined massive artillery, assault infantry trained in the new rapid penetration tactics, tanks that advanced with the infantry, and aviation that suppressed German artillery and rear depots. This integration had not existed in 1941 nor in 1942. It was the result of years of analysis, training, and reform doctrine. The fourth pillar was the relentless exploitation of success. When the German defenses gave way in the first days, the Soviet mechanized and armored corps did not wait to consolidate the position, but continued advancing at maximum speed towards the deep objectives: the pocket around Vitebsk, the encirclement of Bobruisk, the race towards Minsk. It was the same pincers technique that the Red Army itself had seen employed against it in the disasters of 1941, but now executed with a precision that the Wehrmacht could no longer counter. In reverse, the German failure had its own factors. Hitler's insistence on the doctrine of strongholds was militarily catastrophic. Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, Bobruisk, cities declared impregnable that in practice absorbed tens of thousands of soldiers who would have been more valuable in an elastic retreat. Each enclosed garrison became a weight that the Soviets could contain with relatively small forces while the bulk advanced around them. The refusal to authorize retreats in time deprived Army Group Center of the only maneuver that could have allowed it to survive, retreating to the Dnieper, then to the Berezina, then to the Vistula, yielding ground but preserving the cohesion of the units. Marshal Model, who arrived when it was already too late to save the front, explicitly recognized in his reports to the OKH that he needed at least double the available divisions to stabilize the situation. His requests for reinforcements were systematically answered with promises of units that arrived when the sectors they were to plug had already collapsed. The mechanism was known. A division was promised for Sector A. It arrived late, Sector A had already yielded, it was redirected to Sector B, which by then had also yielded, and so on. It was the logic of a crisis that propagates faster than any available response. Reinforcements arrived in small doses, from sectors that in turn needed them. It was the classic problem of an army that fought simultaneously in the east, in Normandy and in Italy, with consumed strategic reserves and a war industry that, despite its notable performance under Minister Speer, could not compensate for the scale of simultaneous losses in several theatres. The figure of Model deserves an additional comment. He was genuinely talented as a defensive commander, energetic, present on the front lines, capable of inspiring troops in situations that seemed without exit. He had stabilized the northern front after the lifting of the siege of Leningrad. He had managed the retreat after Kursk with fewer losses than the situation threatened. On the western front, after the failure of July 20th, he would take command in Normandy and force a pause in the Allied advance sufficient to reorganize the defense. But in Belarus in July of 1944, the magnitude of the collapse exceeded even his capabilities. When a front breaks across 300 kilometers wide simultaneously, there is no tactical genius who can plug it with the available means. Could it have been avoided, the 5 unknowns that Bagration left open? Bagration destroyed Army Group Center in 6 weeks, but like all catastrophe of historical scale, it left behind it questions that historians have continued debating for decades. The first question without a definitive answer is how much exactly German intelligence knew about the Soviet concentration before June 22nd. Colonel Reinhard Gehlen and his Fremde Heere Ost had correctly identified part of the accumulation of forces in the Belarus sector, but had underestimated its magnitude and misinterpreted its objective. Was it a genuine intelligence failure, amplified by the brilliant Soviet maskirovka, or were there also confirmation bias factors, that is, analysts who saw what the High Command wanted to see? Gehlen's subsequent memoirs, written during the Cold War when he was head of the West German intelligence service, tend to overestimate the quality of his work and to attribute the failures to political interference. Soviet and German declassified archives offer a more nuanced image. The second question is if Hitler's stronghold strategy had any plausible military logic beyond his stubbornness. Some military historians have argued that the stronghold garrisons effectively delayed the Soviet advance in some sectors, forcing the attackers to leave forces to keep them surrounded. In the case of Bobruisk, the garrison resisted for several days more than planned, which forced the Soviet 65th Army to commit more resources than planned in the encirclement. But against this one must weigh the cost. Tens of thousands of experienced combat German soldiers sacrificed in garrisons that could not be relieved, instead of being available for retreat and reconstitution of the front. The third issue is the controversial Soviet inaction in the face of the Warsaw Uprising. The historical debate between positions that see in it a deliberate political calculation of Stalin and those that attribute it mainly to genuine logistical limitations remains without closing. The complexity of the matter is reflected in the fact that Rokossovsky himself, the commander of the First Belarusian Front, was Polish by birth, son of a railroad worker from Warsaw, and had himself suffered the terror of Stalin's purges in the 30s. His memoirs, written under the Soviet regime, could not treat the topic with freedom. What he said in private about the decision not to cross the Vistula in August of 1944 is not known. The fourth unknown is the real extent of German losses. Soviet figures speak of more than 300,000 total casualties. Post-war German studies tend to give somewhat lower figures for irrecoverable casualties, but recognize the almost total destruction of 17 infantry divisions and the mutilation of many more. The complete data of the German military archive in Freiburg have never been systematized in a definitive way for the specific period of Bagration. Finally, there is a question that Soviet generals themselves pose in their memoirs and that modern military historians have examined. Could the Red Army have crossed the Vistula in August of 1944 and reached Berlin before the end of that year, thus shortening the war in Europe? Those who answer yes argue that the August halt was a lost opportunity caused by Stalin's excessive caution, who feared getting too far ahead of his own supply lines in hostile territory. Those who answer no point out that the logistical exhaustion was real, that the Germans had partially reconstituted their front on the Vistula with divisions brought from other theatres, and that an isolated penetration without adequate supply bases would have been vulnerable to counterattacks. In any case, the Vistula-Oder offensive of January of 1945, which advanced 600 kilometers in 2 weeks, suggested that when logistical conditions were prepared, the Red Army was perfectly capable of moving with that speed. Operation Bagration was not only the greatest defeat of the Wehrmacht in the Second World War, it was also one of the most refined exercises of operational art of the entire war, and its analysis remained a subject of study in the military academies of the Soviet Union and after the war in those of the United States and Western Europe. The Soviet concept of deep operation, developed theoretically in the 30s by thinkers like General Alexander Svechin and Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, then executed in Stalin's purges, found in Bagration its most complete practical expression. The central idea was that the tactical breakthrough of the first enemy defensive line was not enough. One had to penetrate simultaneously through all defensive lines, including operational and strategic reserves in depth, to create a collapse that the enemy could not patch. The coordination of the four fronts of Bagration, with their staggered objectives in depth and their mobile exploitations that advanced while the infantry consolidated the breakthrough, was the exact materialization of that theory. The military analysts of the Pentagon who in the 80s developed the operational concept of the air-land battle, designed to counteract a hypothetical Soviet attack in Central Europe, studied Bagration with particular attention. The notion of attacking simultaneously in multiple echelons in depth, of not giving the defender time to reconstitute or move reserves, was exactly the problem that US doctrine had to solve in a defensive sense. The analyses also drew attention to the integration between conventional operations and guerrilla warfare, which in Bagration was more coordinated and more effective than in any previous operation. The night of June 19th, with its 10,500 simultaneous railroad demolitions, was an example of synchronization between regular and irregular forces that later theorists of hybrid warfare have repeatedly cited. The original study of the Soviet General Staff on the operation, which served as the basis for Harrison's book, was drafted in the immediate post-war period by staff officers who had participated in it. The operational precision of the document, its tables of force densities, of predicted advance speeds versus real ones, of ammunition consumption, of pontoon bridge performance, constituted for decades the most detailed reference available on the planning and execution of a Soviet strategic offensive. Every history of operations runs the risk of becoming a catalogue of divisions, corps and fronts, numerical abstractions that hide the individual experience of the combatants. Bagration was lived by millions of people, and the memoirs and testimonies that survived offer fragments of that experience that organization charts do not capture. The soldier Nikolai Ivanovich Safonov, a conscript from Kaluga who had lived through the German occupation as a child and was recruited in 1944, recalled years later that his basic training taught him almost nothing useful for real combat. The instructor told me that in the attack there would be such a quantity of dead that in 5 minutes there would be enough rifles for everyone. It was a brutal arithmetic, and it was true. Soviet frontline divisions were far from their theoretical strength of 10,700 men. Many began Bagration with 7,000 or fewer. Casualties in the first days were absorbed immediately by new waves of conscripts. Lieutenant Vasily Repin, assigned to an engineer battalion in the preparatory period of Bagration, described weeks building log roads through the Belarusian marshes so that heavy vehicles could reach the starting positions. We worked day and night, up to our necks in cold mud. The clothes dried on us while we worked, but we did it with enormous enthusiasm, knowing for what those roads were being built. On the German side, the soldier Hans, whose letter to his family was intercepted and preserved in the archives, wrote from the front in the first days of Bagration, "We don't understand anything. We are surrounded everywhere. No one tells us what is happening. The comrades who should be to our left have disappeared. The Russen don't stop." Many letters like that never reached their destination. German generals who survived left in their memoirs an image of perplexity at the speed and scale of the collapse. Marshal Medel, in his dispatches to the OKH during July of 1944, used a vocabulary that had rarely appeared in previous German reports: untenable, impossible, unprecedented catastrophe. He was a man known for his toughness and his mandatory optimism before his troops, but in the reports to his superiors he could not disguise the magnitude of the disaster. Among Soviet soldiers, the dominant sensation after the capture of Minsk was not so much jubilation as exhaustion mixed with something similar to astonishment at the magnitude of what was destroyed. The streets of Minsk were full of abandoned German equipment: guns, trucks, backpacks, first aid kits, personal letters, photographs. The columns of prisoners marching east were endless, dusty, silent. From Minsk to the Oder, the 9 months that followed the collapse of Bagration. In the summer of 1944, while Bagration raised the Eastern Front, on June 6 the Western Allies had landed in Normandy. The Reich now faced a war on 2 fronts whose intensity exceeded any capacity for coordinated response. The simultaneity of Bagration and the Normandy landings was not accidental. In the Tehran Conference of November of 1943, Stalin, Roosevelt and Churchill had committed to coordinate their operations so that Germany could not transfer divisions from one front to another. The landing in Normandy and the Soviet summer offensive were concerted to occur with few weeks of difference, and so it occurred. When Hitler tried to move panzer divisions from the Western Front to the Eastern one in July of 1944 to plug the holes of Bagration, the needs of the Normandy Front prevented it. When Rommel and von Rundstedt asked for reinforcements to contain the Allied breakthrough after D-Day, those reinforcements were being destroyed in Belarus. The result was a strategic paralysis that sealed the fate of Germany. The Reich could not win the war from the summer of 1944. The question was how much time it could prolong it, and at what cost in lives, both German and those of its enemies. The German Wehrmacht, which in 1941 had seemed invincible, which had demonstrated in innumerable encounters its tactical superiority over its enemies, could no longer compensate for numerical and logistical inferiority with its traditional virtues of decentralized command, initiative of individual soldiers and reaction speed. The reason was multiple. 3 years of massive casualties had exhausted the cadre of experienced officers and non-commissioned officers. Hitler's increasing interference in operational decisions, with his orders of resistance to the last man, inhibited the tactical flexibility that had been the most precious advantage of the Wehrmacht. and the Red Army, which in 1941 had been surpassed at all levels by its German adversaries, had closed much of that competence gap. Operation Bagration officially ended on August 19th of 1944, but its consequences continued developing during the following 9 months until the German surrender. Army Group North, trapped in the Baltic countries after the Soviet advance to the Baltic, remained converted into the Kurland Pocket, a mass of 30 divisions defending a reduced perimeter in Latvia, which by Hitler's order was to resist until the end. It resisted indeed until the general capitulation of May 8th of 1945. It was a monument to Hitler's obstinacy and a senseless loss of the last German military resources, more than 200,000 soldiers immobilized in a coastal strip while Berlin fell. In Poland, the remnants of Army Group Center, renamed and partially reconstituted, tried to hold the Vistula. The Vistula-Oder offensive of January 12th of 1945, launched by Zhukov and Konev with more than 2 million soldiers, swept away those defenses in little more than 2 weeks. On February 1st, the advanced units of the Red Army were on the Oder. Berlin was 60 kilometers away. The destruction of Army Group Center in Belarus in the summer of 1944 was the definitive turning point of the Eastern Front. It was not Stalingrad, although Stalingrad was the symbol. It was not Kursk, although Kursk proved that the Red Army could resist the greatest armored attack in history. It was Bagration, the operation that not only defeated the Germans but destroyed the instrument itself of German resistance, Army Group Center, in less time than any army had destroyed another of such size in the history of the 20th century. It was called so after a general who died in Borodino, defending Russia against another invader who also thought his victory was inevitable. The name was a promise and it was fulfilled. The stabilization of the front in August of 1944 was temporary. In the following months, the Red Army continued systematically dismantling the rest of German military power in the east. In September, the First Baltic Front reached the Baltic Sea near Memel, physically cutting the land link of Army Group North with the rest of the Reich. The 30 divisions trapped in the Kurland Pocket received orders to resist until the end. They fought 3 large Soviet offensives to eliminate them, without definitive success until the surrender of May of 1945. It was one of the most striking examples of how Hitler's orders not to yield ground could immobilize valuable forces in strategically meaningless enclosures. In Hungary, in October of 1944, the Soviets launched an offensive towards Budapest that would lead to a 50-day siege of the Hungarian capital. Army Group South tried to counterattack with the last available panzer reserves. The last great German offensive on the Eastern Front, Operation Frühlingswachen in Hungary in March of 1945, which employed the Tiger II tanks and the Waffen-SS divisions that Hitler withdrew from the Oder front for that purpose, failed completely and accelerated the final collapse in Austria. On the Central Front, the Vistula-Oder offensive of January 12th of 1945 was in a certain sense the winter version of Bagration. Zhukov's First Belarusian Front and Konev's First Ukrainian Front employed 2.2 million soldiers, 6,400 tanks, and more than 46,000 pieces of artillery against a German front on the Vistula which, although it had been partially reconstituted, did not have the depth or the reserves to absorb a blow of that magnitude. In 16 days, the Red Army advanced up to 600 kilometers. On January 31st, the First Belarusian Front crossed the Oder and established bridgeheads 60 kilometers from Berlin. The Battle of Berlin, from April 16th to May 2nd of 1945, was the final chapter. Zhukov's First Belarusian Front and Konev's First Ukrainian Front overtook each other in a race that Stalin himself deliberately stimulated to create competition between his 2 best commanders. On May 2nd, General Helmut Weidling, last Kampfkommandant of Berlin, signed the surrender of the garrison. On May 8th in Karlshorst, the unconditional surrender of all German armed forces closed the war in Europe. There is a dimension of Bagration that remains partially in shadows: the daily life of terror under German occupation and the transition to the new Soviet administration experienced by the Belarusian civilian population. Belarus was one of the most devastated territories of the entire Second World War. It is estimated that a third of its pre-war population, perhaps 2.5 million people, died between 1941 and 1944. Exact figures remain a subject of research because the German occupation records themselves and those of the subsequent Soviet period are in many cases incomplete, manipulated or directly destroyed. Belarusian Jews who had constituted a vibrant cultural community with centers in Minsk, Vitebsk, Brest and dozens of smaller cities had been almost totally annihilated. The communities of Pinsk, of Baranovichi, of Lida, exterminated. The Minsk ghetto, in which more than 80,000 people had lived before the war, was liquidated in 1943. When the Red Army liberated Belarus in the summer of 1944, the soldiers found burned villages, improvised cemeteries, survivors who in many cases were the last members of their families. The weight of that encounter appears in some veteran testimonies, although official Soviet historiography tended to frame the liberation exclusively in military and patriotic terms, without pausing on the scale of the genocide that had preceded the offensive. The transition from German occupation to Soviet administration was also not unconditionally liberating for the entire population. Men of fighting age from the newly liberated areas were recruited immediately, sometimes with only the minimum days of basic training. Networks of collaborators with the German occupation, real or suspected, were subject to investigation by the NKVD. Members of non-communist resistance movements, those who had been active in the Polish Armia Krajowa or in Belarusian resistance groups of nationalist orientation, ran the risk of being treated as elements hostile to the Soviet state instead of as resistance fighters. In 6 weeks of the summer of 1944, Operation Bagration destroyed 4 German armies, captured 57,000 soldiers who paraded humiliated through Moscow and advanced 600 kilometers towards Berlin. It was not Stalingrad the real turning point of the Second World War, it was this. Army Group Center, 800,000 men, ceased to exist as a fighting force. While Belarus fell, the Allies landed in Normandy. Germany fought on 2 simultaneous fronts without reserves for either. The Reich that in 1941 believed it would conquer Russia in 12 weeks died exactly where its arrogance was born, on the plains of the East, devoured by the army it underestimated.